Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something that is absolutely going to change how you look at every single rule, test, and system that governs our lives. I mean, think about it. From schools to hospitals to workplaces, systems are constantly judging us. But how do we make sure a judgment about our performance doesn't suddenly warp into a judgment about our actual fundamental worth? Well, we are going to explore a brilliant mental model from our source article today, The Human Floor as a Moral Checkpoint. Okay, let's dive into this. Does a failing grade mean you're failing a humanity? Seriously, think about how often we or people we love feel completely reduced to just one label: a bad credit score, a rejection letter, a job title, or a standardized test score. We take this one single metric and bam, suddenly it feels like this absolute crushing verdict on who we are as a human being. But why does that happen so easily? And more importantly, how do we stop it? Well, to really get to the bottom of this, we kind of have to face an uncomfortable truth. Our modern world absolutely has to run on systems. Educational, legal, medical, economic, they all need systems just to keep the lights on. A university literally cannot evaluate every single beautiful, complex aspect of your entire existence when deciding whether to admit you, right? A trauma surgeon just needs your vital signs and medical history, not your whole life story. These systems necessarily have to simplify us into categories and metrics just so they can actually function. So, the simplification itself? That's not actually the bad guy here. We need those categories. The real problem, the exact moment these necessary abstractions turn toxic, is when they overstep their original boundaries. Look, it's entirely possible to be a low-performing student, an unsuitable job applicant, or even a convicted criminal. But the danger hits when that highly specific, local failure is quietly twisted into this massive, totalizing judgment that you are somehow a lesser human being, undeserving of basic dignity. And that brings us to the absolute genius solution from our source material, the human floor. Picture this as a mandatory security checkpoint. In society, we often start with a moral rule, an ought, like, hey, the most qualified candidate ought to get the job. But before we can actually apply that rule to a living, breathing person, we have to pass it through this checkpoint. It literally forces us to hit pause and ask, wait, what does this rule actually justify when we translate it into real-world human consequences? And this brilliantly illustrates what that checkpoint is actually doing. It acts as a solid barrier. On one side, you've got a local system judgment. So a school's grading system might completely accurately determine someone is a low-performing student in math. Fair enough. But the human floor steps in and absolutely blocks that local judgment from bleeding over into a total human judgment, that dangerous, entirely false leap that they are a low-capability person or just less valuable overall. To really make this click, the framework gives us two essential concepts. Concept number one, system standing. This is just asking, do you meet the criteria for a specific role? Let's say you don't have a degree in structural engineering. Well, then you lack the system standing to pull up a chair at the engineering table and design a suspension bridge. You're excluded from that specific job, and honestly, you should be. But here is the flip side, and this is absolutely crucial. Even if you get kicked out of the engineering room, you completely retain the second concept, human standing. What does that actually mean? It means if those same engineers decide to route their brand new bridge right through your living room and bulldoze your house, you are still profoundly morally relevant to that decision. Losing system standing doesn't cost you your human standing. You're still a person whose interests absolutely must be considered. Let's bring this right back to that student example. When a school slaps a failing grade on a math exam, it's measuring performance under incredibly narrow, specific conditions. That one failed test completely misses the bigger picture. It doesn't measure artistic ability, moral character, leadership skills, creativity, athletic talent, your future potential, or your overall worth as a human. It's a perfect reminder of just how blind and limited these systems actually are when they try to tell us who someone really is. Because of this limitation, systems can't just make up rules on the fly. They have to show their work. As the text puts it, a criterion isn't relevant just because someone in charge says it is. Think about a courtroom. A lawyer can't just stand up and say, Your Honor, the defendant's red shoes prove he committed the burglary. No way. They have to prove exactly how the shoes connect to the crime. Systems have to expose their reasoning out in the open so we can actually challenge it. And even when a system does prove a rule is relevant, we hit another huge roadblock. The reach of a justification is limited. Imagine two people fighting for the very last spot on a football team. One is slightly better at throwing the ball, so they get the spot. That makes total sense, right? That's justified.
But that passing ability definitely does not justify giving that player extra political rights or moving them to the front of the line at the emergency room. The justification literally runs out the second it steps off the football field.
This helps us really understand how to look at hierarchy. See, the human floor isn't demanding some utopia of perfectly equal outcomes, and it doesn't hate merit. It is totally fine to have a hierarchy of suitability for doling out scarce opportunities, like jobs or roster spots, but the checkpoint strictly forbids that setup from mutating into a hierarchy of humanity. Winning a spot in a system never, ever makes you a superior species of human being. So what happens when a label needs to jump from one system to a totally different one? The article calls these traveling classifications. Let's take a serious fraud conviction. That judgment happens in a courtroom, sure, but it can legitimately travel over to the financial sector to stop that person from managing a client's retirement fund. The reasoning holds up. However, that exact same fraud conviction cannot travel over to a hospital to deny them a life-saving surgery. The justification just doesn't stretch that far. Interestingly, the human floor even works as a checkpoint when people claim they're acting on higher or ultimate authority. If a system insists its rules come from a divine command, the human floor doesn't argue theology. Instead, it just looks really objectively at the chain of events. It points out that any claimed divine command still has to pass through human interpretation, human enforcement, and ultimately causes human consequences. The checkpoint forces us to heavily scrutinize those highly fallible human steps in the middle. Now, we do need to point out a limitation here. Think about using a GPS. Just because your GPS calculates a perfectly flawless, super efficient route to a destination doesn't actually mean the destination itself is a good place to go. It's the same with the human floor. It ensures a rule is applied fairly and doesn't strip away anyone's humanity, but it doesn't automatically mean the underlying moral system is perfect. It's just policing the application of the rule. So how do we actually test the rules we're creating? The text hands us this incredibly powerful diagnostic tool called the capacity reversal test. All you have to do is ask yourself, would I still think the justification for this rule is fair if I didn't personally have the wealth, the health, the smarts, or the specific talents that currently put me on the winning side of it? This is a game changer for exposing when a rule is secretly propped up by our own personal advantages. You can actually take this test and apply it right now in your workplace, your school, or your community in 3 really simple steps. First, hold humanity fixed. Remember, everyone involved is a human. Second, strip away your specific advantages and imagine yourself trapped in the disadvantaged spot under the rule you're defending. Third, reevaluate. Does the justification still hold water? If the rule suddenly feels incredibly unfair just because you swapped chairs, well, it's probably a bad rule for humans. As we wrap up this explainer, there's one quick thing we need to clarify. Having human standing means your interests absolutely have to be considered, but it doesn't mean you automatically get to actively participate in making the decision. Think about an unconscious patient in an ICU. They can't exactly sit up and vote on their surgery plan, but they still matter immensely in a moral sense. The system still has to treat their humanity as the #1 priority, even without them participating. And that brings us to a beautiful summary of everything we've looked at today. The human floor isn't some naive fantasy trying to guarantee equal outcomes for everyone on Earth. It fully accepts that competition, scarcity, and losing are real things. It doesn't tell us who has to win. Instead, it demands that we justify the rules by which anyone is allowed to lose. It means we can have deep, passionate disagreements about things without ever needing to kick our opponents out of the human race. I want to leave you with this incredibly powerful thought from the text. Moral conviction is not yet human application. The human floor is the checkpoint that keeps those two judgments apart. So I challenge you, look around at the systems you're a part of right now. Which ones are secretly judging your humanity? And what are you going to do to build a floor beneath them? Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer, and keep learning.